Hello, I'm Jan Ashlewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. For decades, the Kremlin sold Africa the story of brotherhood against colonialism. Now, Ukraine is trying to rewrite that script. But Russia's got the old playbook, the local contacts, and a few thousand armed mercenaries who don't care about the footnotes. The message is simple. Moscow is Africa's true friend. The West is the old master. And Ukraine, well, that's just the West's puppet, you see. For many Africans, that propaganda lands. So on this episode, we're looking at how Kyiv's late start in Africa became Moscow's early advantage. Here is a look at our latest report to find out more.
For nearly a decade, a shadowy force operated across Africa, one that blurred the lines between private enterprise and state ambition. It was known as the Wagner Group. Founded by Russian oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin, Wagner began as a private military company but quickly evolved into a powerful tool of Kremlin influence. Though unofficial, its operations were anything but small-scale. Wagner's African journey began in Sudan in 2017, where it secured gold mining concessions and trained local security forces. By 2018, it had expanded into the Central African Republic, offering personal protection to President Tuareg and engaging in combat against rebel factions, all while controlling diamond mines. From there, Wagner's footprint spread rapidly. Wagner's model was simple: security services in exchange for access to natural resources, gold, diamonds, and oil. But its operations were marred by allegations of human rights abuses, including the 2022 Mora massacre in Mali, where hundreds of civilians were reportedly killed. Strategically, Wagner helped Russia gain a foothold in North Africa, threatening NATO's southern flank and asserting control over key maritime routes. But its semi-private status created confusion and chaos. Command structures were opaque, accountability was limited, and its actions often contradicted international norms.
And now we're zoning in on the explaining portion of our show. After the fall of the Wagner Group, the Kremlin has rebranded its operations under direct state control, introducing the Africa Corps, a new force reshaping alliances and influence across the continent.
With the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Kremlin moved swiftly to dismantle Wagner's semi-autonomous empire. In its place, a new entity emerged, the Africa Corps. Unlike Wagner, the Africa Corps is fully integrated into Russia's Ministry of Defense. It is no longer a murky network of mercenaries. It is a formal arm of the Russian state. The Africa Corps retains Wagner's core mission, providing regime protection, military training, and battlefield support, but now under direct state control. Profits from mining and security contracts flow straight to Moscow, not private hands. But this isn't just a rebrand, it's a recalibration of Russia's foreign policy. With Western forces retreating from the Sahel, Russia is positioning itself as a stable, long-term ally to authoritarian regimes. Beyond security, the Corps exports Russia's governance model: centralized control, suppression of dissent, and resource-linked patronage. For many African leaders, this offers a blueprint for power. For civil society, it raises alarms.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. When the United Nations gathered in March 2022 to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, only 28 African countries voted in favor. More than half either abstained or sided with Moscow. For Kyiv, it was a rude awakening. A reminder that while Europe and North America rallied behind Ukraine, an entire continent remained largely unconvinced. In response, Ukraine launched its African strategy later that year, a diplomatic blueprint to counter Russian influence across the continent. It promised new embassies, new trade links, and a new kind of solidarity, one built not on power, but on shared experience, the experience of resisting an empire. 3 years later, how is that going? Well, let's just say it isn't a story with a Hollywood ending, at least not yet. For starters, President Volodymyr Zelensky didn't set foot in Africa until April 2025. His first visit to South Africa came long after Russia's Wagner Group had already dug itself deep into the Sahel. Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger, countries that once hosted French troops, have since swapped Paris for Moscow. Former Wagner Group mercenaries offer protection, training and political muscle. In exchange, they get gold, uranium and leverage. It's the 21st century version of empire, privatized, deniable and armed to the teeth. And it works. In the Central African Republic, the Africa Corps doesn't just protect the president, it controls entire mining regions. Russian operatives run disinformation networks on Facebook, radio stations, even make music videos. It draws on decades of Cold War nostalgia when the Soviet Union trained African officers, built infrastructure, and gave out scholarships. That memory has outlived the Soviet flag. And Ukraine, as one of its former republics, now finds itself fighting against its own historical shadow. Kyiv is now trying to change all that. Its humanitarian initiative, Grain from Ukraine, has delivered food aid to over 8 million people in Ethiopia, Somalia, Nigeria, Sudan and beyond. That is smart diplomacy. Feeding people wins hearts faster than speeches ever could. But diplomacy is only part of the game. According to reports, Ukraine has also been quietly supporting groups opposed to pro-Russian regimes, like Tuareg rebels in Mali or military factions in Sudan. When word got out that Kyiv was allegedly sharing intelligence with anti-government forces in Mali, both Mali and Niger cut diplomatic ties with Ukraine entirely. The regional bloc ECOWAS accused Kyiv of external interference. In other words, you're doing exactly what you accuse Moscow of doing. And that's the irony. When a small democracy like Ukraine tries to play the big power game, it's easy to look like the villain. Russia, meanwhile, doesn't have that problem. It is perfectly comfortable being the villain. And for now, the scoreboard unfortunately still favors Moscow. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Denis Kolesnik, president of the MENA Research Center. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So Ukraine is trying to convince African countries to be more skeptical towards Russia and its plans for Africa. But do you think that this is a losing battle, given that so far most of them, unfortunately, have chosen to remain aligned with the Kremlin?
You know, in order to propose something, in order to actually ask something or to make a real impact on the decisions, you have to propose something. What currently Ukraine can propose that Russia cannot, or even let me rephrase it. Russians have unfortunately much more to propose to the African countries than Ukraine as of today. And if mostly we are talking about the military juntas, for instance, the Ukrainians, they have quite limited abilities to propose security for those juntas and regimes on place, while Russia, since the Wagner Group and the African Corp, which took over later on, has this possibility.
And speaking of the African Corp, let's briefly mention that. Do you think that Russia actually appreciates the irony of naming this unit in such a way, or is it intentional?
You know, we all remember that starting in 2014, it was the Russia's private military company, which actually is forbidden by the Russian legislation, per se, was active at first in Crimea and Donbass in Ukraine, then in Syria, and then expanded its operations roughly at around 2017-2018 into Africa, where it was quite successful, bringing actually the money to Russia by controlling the, for instance, the diamond mines in Central African Republic via such firms tied directly to late Prigozhin, Lobaya Invest, and, for example, the gold mines in Sudan. But with the, let's say, shift in Russia's approach and the 2023 Wagner's mutiny, the Africa Corp emerged in 2024, and the name should reflect actually Russia's updated approach towards Africa, and we know that the Russia's foreign policy document strategy actually, for the first time in history, has dedicated a chapter to Africa. If I remember well, it was chapter 4 or chapter 5. The whole chapter dedicated to Africa, highlighting the importance of this continent to Russia.
So perhaps the only thing that is consistent when we think of the other Africa Corps is that both of them are about control, right? They're not about being benevolent towards the territories which they inhabit. Now, speaking of the Africa Corps and what used to be the Wagner Group, do you think that it has, from Russia's perspective, changed for the better? I mean, with Mr. Prigozhin out of the loop permanently, came certain advantages, but aren't they also losing out some of the plausible deniability?
You know, the answer could be actually twofold. On the one hand, both Wagner and Africa Corp were controlled by Russia, directly or indirectly. If Africa Corp is directly controlled by the Ministry of Defense and the GRU, so the Wagner was controlled and aligned, was mostly controlled and had ties to the GRU units, but had some autonomy in its tactics and strategy in the countries where it was deployed. And the key difference, actually, that Wagner was somehow self-funded due to the access to the sources in Africa, while Africa Corp is relying on the MOD budget. And with the war, with the Russia-Ukrainian war going on, we know that the key priority for Russia's Ministry of Defense is the Ukrainian theater, which means that the majority of the funds are allocated to the operations, to the Russian operations against Ukraine, which hinders somehow, and we know that there are some problems with funding regarding the Africa Corp. At the same time, while Wagner was quite decisive and took active action in the fights, Africa Corp is rather reserved its activities to, advisory and training of the local units.
Would you say that they lost some of the efficiency? I mean, there are reports from Mali that they have failed to quell the advance of the jihadists, in which case the junta might think, okay, if they are not actually helping us and if they are difficult to coordinate with our own forces, then why do we need them at all?
Exactly. For a few African juntas, including the Mali, it poses problems because they may think that they have gambled on the wrong partner, because they were so happy to oust France and to draw the French presence out of the country, hoping that the Russians would help them to solidify the regimes and to fight against the jihadists and to fight against, for example, Tuaregs in the north of Mali. And in 2000, if I remember well, in August 2024, there was quite a defeat for the Russian forces near the Algerian border near the city of Tinzaouatin. So yes, it seems that a few African junta leaders may be considering, or at least asking themselves questions, whether they did choose wisely their allies.
So earlier on you said that Ukraine cannot offer the same degree of security, military assistance, but what can Ukraine do? How can Ukraine search for an opening? Let's start with something that's totally not controversial, meaning Grain from Ukraine, the initiative, helping people survive by offering food from Ukraine's agriculture industry.
Yes, you can have two approaches, but in the countries where you have juntas, impacting the public opinion will not do much, at least in short and mid-term. At the same time, Russians have deployed also the information operations, framing the grain from Ukraine as the Russian grain, actually, and even exporting the grain stolen from Ukraine and presenting it as Russian. What Ukraine, in my opinion, could do is actually the soft power activities, and trying to influence the public opinion in the countries such as Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, maybe even junta countries, but understanding that this kind of efforts would take years or maybe even a decade for the locals to have a different opinion about, for example, Russia and Ukraine. At the same time, the Ukrainians cannot allocate the same resources, financial resources, as Russians do. Russians buy journalists in Central African Republic, for example. Ukrainians, I never heard of or never read of doing the same. So maybe the Ukrainians have to, let's say, create a new or to develop a new approach towards African countries, and maybe under the lens rather of soft power than a direct military support or training missions.
So now, how can this be done, do you think? Because this is a paradox, right? Ukraine has an absolutely spectacular narrative here. Ukraine can say to the African countries, look, we are victims of colonialism, just like you were. However, this is difficult to actually convey because Ukraine would need possibly some support from Western countries. But Western countries, well, they have lots of bad press in Africa exactly for the same reason, namely colonialism. Whereas Russia can still portray itself as being anti-colonial because during the Soviet era, they were fighting against the West. They were pouring money into industrial projects, education, and so on. So how do you think this paradox could be solved?
The problem is that in a number of places, Ukraine is still considered as somehow Russia or brotherly nation, even if you want, in quotes. And unfortunately, when people learn something during the years and decades, it is quite difficult to eradicate. And Ukrainians were completely absent, not only in Africa, but also in Europe, and mainly in Western Europe. They didn't have their narrative. They didn't talking about their history. They considered it unimportant or unimportant to spend resources on, while Russians were doing everything. And even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, before 2014 aggression, even before 2008, Russians were spending immense money in the Western countries and in African countries later on to actually channel its narrative, to explain the worldview, not only about the Russia-Ukraine war, but about the world. And unfortunately, many Africans, including in Algeria, by the way, who still see the world, or at least some of the conflicts, through the Russian lens. And what are Ukrainians doing? Do they have TV channels in Africa? Do they propose the content to the African journalists, for example? How do they cooperate? That's quite an issue. And I guess the Ukrainians are quite busy trying to not lose the war against Russia.
And a very quick question, because we're running out of time. Should Ukraine use hard power? Should it help the rebels? Because this, as some situations have actually proven recently, can also backfire.
There were some reports, for example, that near the Tinza-Vatin in 2024, that the Ukrainian military intelligence was present, or at least was coordinating some of the fightings or some of the operations. Ukrainians can propose this, and they were also present in Sudan at some point. But the question is, again, what kind of relations will they have with the African leaders, and what kind of protection or what kind of services they can propose to the junta regimes as well, and whether will it backfire to them on the international arena, it's also a question. So I guess they have to work really hard on developing their African strategy.
Denis Kolesnik was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight into the subject.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Following local elections in Georgia over the weekend, tensions fled in the capital as a protest billed as a peaceful revolution ended in chaos. Police clashed with demonstrators near the presidential palace, raising fresh concerns about the country's political future.
In central Tbilisi, what began as a massive peaceful protest on October 4th quickly spiraled into confrontation. Tens of thousands filled Rustaveli Avenue and Freedom Square, waving Georgian and EU flags, demanding change after local elections widely boycotted by opposition. By nightfall, a group of protesters attempted to storm the presidential palace, tearing down fencing before being repelled by riot police using pepper spray and water cannons. The ruling Georgian Dream ruling party, closely aligned with Moscow, declared sweeping victories across all municipalities that evening, celebrating as clashes erupted nearby. Organizers of the protest, including opera singer Pata Burchuladze, were arrested hours later, accused of inciting violence and attempting to overthrow the government. With arrests, injuries and accusations flying, Georgia's political crisis deepens, leaving many to wonder what comes next.
The populist ANO party, led by Andrej Babiš, has won the Czech Republic's parliamentary elections, securing around 35% of the vote. The result positions Babiš to begin coalition talks with right-wing and Eurosceptic factions.
In a decisive win, the populist ANO party, led by billionaire and former Prime Minister Andrej Babiš, has emerged victorious in the Czech Republic's parliamentary elections, claiming around 35% of the vote. With nearly all ballots counted, ANO leads with 81 seats in the 200-member Chamber of Deputies, but falls short of a majority, setting the stage for coalition talks with right-wing and Eurosceptic factions. Babiš, known for his criticism of aid to Ukraine and admiration for nationalist leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orbán, is expected to partner with the far-right SPD and Motorists for Themselves parties. His return to power threatens Prague's landmark ammunition initiative, which has supplied Ukraine with vital artillery shells and earned praise from President Zelensky. While the Czech Republic has been a key ally to Kyiv since Russia's invasion, Babiš has vowed to scale back support, calling Ukraine's EU membership bid premature and urging NATO to take over military aid efforts.
Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service says China provided satellite data to Russia for missile attacks on Ukrainian territory. The cooperation reportedly helped Moscow identify strategic targets, including sites tied to foreign investors.
Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service has confirmed evidence of Chinese-Russian cooperation in satellite reconnaissance, supporting Russian missile strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. Intelligence officials say Chinese data guided targeting decisions, though specific sites remain undisclosed. One confirmed strike destroyed the American-owned Flex Electronics factory in western Ukraine's Mukachevo on August 21st. Says that our officials also report China supplied components for Russian drones and ammunition, with Chinese electronics making up 80% of Russian drone systems by early 2025. Despite Beijing's claims of neutrality, Ukrainian officials say China provides chemicals, gunpowder and machinery to roughly 20 Russian military plants. China has dismissed the allegations as politically motivated, but Kyiv warns the cooperation poses a serious threat to foreign investments and battlefield security.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.